the vintage vibe. And whether you love vintage audio like me, or whether you're here today because you just love great sounding music and you aspire to build, well, a period correct system that sounds great playing your music, it shouldn't have to cost you an arm or a leg to do so. And in fact, these unassuming Advent 3002 loudspeakers, probably from the early 1980s, were a reminder to me today that just that, you can, with the right synergy, build a great system on the cheap. Now, within about 30 seconds of listening to these speakers connected to my Marantz receiver, I realized I had something special going on. So the episode today is dedicated towards budget speakers and building a system on the cheap that sounds great. We're going to take a look at some speakers from Canada, the USA, as well as overseas, and we'll talk about whether they deserve a place in your vintage audio collection on the cheap, on the vintage vibe. Stick around. And straight from Japan, let's start with these Denon SC-E2002s. Now, if you're thinking these are some pretty impressive specs, just keep in mind these are only about 7.5 inches wide by about 12 inches tall. And you know what? The drivers scream quality. Unfortunately, these cheap stickered veneer cabinets are only about 5.2 kilos a piece. Thankfully, we have some decent binding posts. Now, Denon is said to have specially tuned these speakers, particularly for the European market. Starting with these 2.5 centimeter dome tweeters, they used a lightweight fiber that was woven into the diaphragm. Now, the 6-inch woofers are also said to have been made out of a special pulp for the diaphragm, which was coated, and, well, they used something called polyamide in the voice coil. I wonder how they sound. And as it would seem for the Europeans, not that great. Now, maybe it's about the synergy. I do have a Denon PMA 1500R, which is from the exact same vintage. It's an ultra-high current MOSFET integrated amp, and it was probably made to match specifically with those speakers. But unfortunately, it's on the bench getting repaired. So I mated it with a very capable Marantz 2230, and I would think that it would have a fighting chance to sound great with that receiver because it is fully recapped and it is capacitor coupled and it's just a splendid sounding unit. But it seemed to lack. The speakers really seemed to lack, and it sounds like an oxymoron, but with kind of purported specs of high frequencies of 30,000 kilohertz. I mean, this is kind of where bats can hear and things like moles and groundhogs. There wasn't a lot of sparkle. There wasn't a lot of magic in the top end. It was just kind of boring. So I thought maybe it's the capacitors. I mean, these are from 1996 and maybe they need to be refurbished. But then again, I've listened to so many speakers that are much older that still sounded a lot better. So, in my opinion, if you happen to see these speakers on the budget between $100 to $200, I would probably keep on walking. Unless you happen to have a office system and a small Denon integrated amp and you need a small footprint speaker that can fit in that office and you can buy them less than $100, then maybe. But otherwise, I just don't think they're up for the task for your vintage audio system. Let's take a peek at our next speakers and see if they're any better. And next, a speaker designer from the USA, which is ADS and their 470L. Now, interestingly, they had really cheap cabinets on these speakers that seemed to crack at all the seams and were made out of a cheap particle board with veneer. But the loudspeakers were borrowed from Braun. In fact, they're great speakers in these cabinets, and they've got simple binding posts on the back, which you'd kind of expect for a modest mid-fi speaker. Now on paper, the ADS don't look that hot. I mean, the Denon surely have better specs. I mean, we're talking 48 hertz, which isn't terribly low, and 20,000 kilohertz, which, you know, should be plenty high. But there's something special about these speakers. The first thing I noticed when I had them hooked up was there is a certain softness to the speaker, and they made you want to turn them louder. Maybe a little less sensitive, but again, the mid-range, the softness in that mid-range, there's something special to these speakers, particularly in the vocal. And there is good bottom end for a speaker that is only 48 hertz, I think plus 3 dB. They seem to play a lot lower. Now, talking about paper, unfortunately, the ADS speakers seem to have a piece of paper that they would put kind of behind the speaker grill. And that diffusion paper, let's call it, would typically come undone and would stick to the speaker, particularly the tweeter that has a dope on it, which gets tacky over the years. So not only does dust stick to the speakers and the grill, but you have to very carefully pry that paper off the tweeter so as not to damage it. In talking about damaged tweeters, it's not unusual for ADS tweeters to be damaged because there are literally two tiny paper-thin wire leads going to the diaphragm of the tweeter, which I had to repair on these speakers with a very steady hand. But this is certainly a speaker that if you happen to find on the cheap, I would say anywhere up to $200, I would gladly steal them. Because I think you are stealing them in that price range because they are that good sounding for a bookshelf speaker. Enter the Canadian underdog, the Camber 3.5Ti loudspeaker. And yes, the Ti does stand for titanium. And now for a piece of interesting Canadian loudspeaker trivia. And only a Canadian would know this. For some of you, you may have heard of a wee little company by the name of Rega. I bet you didn't know, though, that the early Rega speakers that came out of the 70s and 80s were not made by Rega at all. And you may be guessing now that perhaps this Canadian company made, in fact, those speakers. And they did. They had rights to the Rega name in the Canadian market, and they distributed across Canada Rega speakers. And they made some fantastic speakers. Up until the point that they had to give back the Rega name when Rega in the UK decided to come to North America and wanted to sell their turntables and thought it'd be confusing for the market to have Rega speakers that they didn't make and Rega turntables that they did. So unfortunately for the Canadian company that was once known as Rega, they had to rebrand and they became known as Plateau. And they jointly used the Canadian National Research Council's facilities alongside other companies by the name of Paradigm, Energy, and EPI, all manufacturers of some great sounding budget speakers and not so budget speakers. And eventually that company named Plateau then changed their name to Plateau Camber and then finally Camber. And one of their better speakers was called the Camber 3.5 and it used a little VIFA soft dome tweeter. It was great sounding by all accounts, and later was to become known as the 3.5Ti using a titanium tweeter that actually won a whole bunch of awards because it sounded so great. Now let's take a peek at those speakers up close. The speakers are bass reflex in design. They're quite substantial in size, and they use a Camber in-house woofer that has a die-cast aluminum basket, polypropylene cone, and high temperature wound voice coils. The tweeters are offset to the outside edge and they're mirror imaged. The asymmetric design spreads out the frequency and the effects of diffraction and reflection from the outer edges of the cabinets. Now both drivers are actually recessed into the front baffle. Now the cabinets, they could be, quite frankly, overbuilt for the price point. So you're getting a very heavy cabinet. It's 3/4 inch press wood. It does use a plastic veneer, but it's not a cheap stick-on veneer like we've seen in the ADS as well as the Denon. These are pretty decent looking, particularly in black. They're well braced. They definitely pass the knock test on the side of the cabinet. You're not getting any unwanted ringing or resonances. They're well dampened. The crossovers are well designed, and the components used in the crossovers are all high quality. Most importantly, how did they sound? They sound fantastic. I mean, they are a very full sounding speaker from bottom to top. And based on their specs, 48 hertz to 20,000 hertz, I would swear they're playing a lot deeper, in fact, into the 30s for sure. And they very well may be. But at times, perhaps the woofer, the shortfall could be, maybe it could be a little underdampened, and it could get loose at points where you find yourself backing off on the bass just ever so slightly. It actually reminds me quite a bit of some of the early Paradigm speakers like the 9 SE Mark II loudspeaker, which was a great all-round speaker, but these Cambers are a little more refined. The sound signature, they play a little wider, certainly a little deeper. There's a little more elegance to the sound than the Paradigm, and I think part of that's got to do with, again, just that attention to detail and the selection of the components. The speakers, when they're faced, forward without a toe in, there's no edginess really to the titanium tweeter. And in fact, you can really pick out nicely the positioning of all the instruments in the soundstage, nice and deep, nice and wide. And the speakers kind of hide in that, the sound is here versus here and here. Now, when you toe them in, you get a little bit more focus with the speakers. They're a little more precise, but the tweeter can get a little brighter sounding depending on the amplification. So all in all, though, these are a pair of speakers that certainly won awards for a reason, and even by today's standards are a great sounding speaker. And if you can find them anywhere between $100 and $300, I think you've done quite well, and these certainly can be a speaker that you can build your vintage audio collection around. Don't forget to join us for part 2 of budget loudspeakers on the Vintage Vibe. Like and subscribe.